Something else that might be looked at in the preamble is the place of the region and the world. There are some constitutions which are very narrow. It seems that they sort of live in complete isolation and not part of a wider region. But if you look at the new Tunisian constitution, it recognizes the state as part of the great Arab Maghreb and notes that its people are part of the Arab nation and the Arab and Islamic nation. And it also, and another question here is the extent to which the Libyan constitution may want to set out the new state aspirations in relation to international law instruments, such as the key documents like the Arab Charter on Human Rights of 2004, and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights of 1986, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the African Charter, which I mentioned, and so on. So this is something that ought to be considered there. And language is another fundamental, which again is dealt with in the transitional document, citizenship, and so on. We move then from the preamble into to the guts of the Constitution, those provisions which will actually be implemented directly. And there, of course, most modern democratic states now set out in writing basic human rights and fundamental liberties. And there's a list of them in the transitional document, including virtually all the traditional social and civil and political rights, such as freedom of expression, freedom from torture, the right to life, a fair trial comes in later, and so on, but supplemented also by socioeconomic rights. Socioeconomic rights were not greatly considered enforceable or desirable until recently. It was felt that it ought to be the government that makes policy. It should be Parliament and the executive that allocates scarce resources. And it was a hostage to fortune to put into a constitution something about the right to clean water or to shelter for everybody or to medical assistance, because these are all expenses and they will always be rationed. But the South African constitution, again, got round that to some extent by only protecting access to social security, clean water, etc., and expressly qualified that by saying that the state should only take reasonable legislative and other measures within its available resources to achieve those rights. So that again reconciles the primary right of the government to allocate scarce resources on the one hand, and on the other, if you want to make that kind of statement, and the Transitional Council seems to want to, or has indicated that they would prefer that at this point, if you want to enshrine socioeconomic rights at that point, then that's a way to do it. There are also, nowadays, environmental rights. Again, people thought, oh, these are not enforceable. The South African Constitutional Court has shown how they can be enforceable. And then there are information rights and access to information rights. The Kenyan Constitution, sorry, not the Kenyan, the new Constitution of Greece, I'm sorry, as amended in 2008, that is, it's an old constitution, but amended more recently, provides the right to internet access. And when this happened, people thought, oh, this is one of these strange Soviet Union type rights, and it could never be enforced, but it's become a very live issue recently, and may be considered, particularly in the Libyan context, when the whole context of the Arab Spring, when people communicated to each other through the internet, that it's one saw how it became. Freedom of religion, of course, is something that needs to be grappled with very carefully, and there will be discussion, I think, about this. And equality. So these rights are important, and within that it has to be decided how the rights will be enforced. Again, there's this model in former Soviet Union countries that we have them and we expect them to be enforced without saying how or why. Are we going to leave it to the courts to strike down legislation or official action that conflicts with the Bill of Rights? In this country, we haven't gone so far. We've said simply, we've tried to reconcile parliamentary sovereignty with these rights. And we've said that if government, through its legislation, invades one of the rights in the European Convention on Human Rights, which is our Bill of Rights, here, then it may simply issue a declaration of incompatibility and goes back to Parliament, and they can decide what to do about it. And other countries like Canada have a slightly different model. Similar to ours, the bill can be struck down, but then, notwithstanding that, Parliament may want to intervene. So the power of the courts is important here, and to establish also a dialogue between the courts and Parliament. So Parliament is forced to consider in all its work, are we looking at rights? Are we invading rights in this particular area? And should we give a certificate of compatibility, as in this country, with the Bill of Rights? Or should there be pre-legislative scrutiny, as in France, or post-legislative scrutiny, as with the French Conseil d'État? So there are all those sorts of questions. We then move to what sort of governmental system do we want? Presidential or parliamentary? A huge question. Always a very big question. There are advantages in both systems. There's advantage in the purely presidential system of having a separately elected president, so there's a kind of direct accountability there, but it gives then, in that case, usually more power to the president than a prime minister would have in a Westminster-style parliamentary system, despite the growing power of the Westminster prime ministers. It's an enormous question, something possibly to debate. Of course, there are different kinds of presidencies. There's a whole shade of them, which we have in the paper. Here we have our non-executive presidency, which is really the Queen, who does very little in the way of interference with legislation, but has backup powers, and is head of state, which is different from the head of government. In the United States, you have the president, who's both head of state, has all the ceremonial powers of the Queen in this country, but also has a huge executive role. He can be, of course, counterbalanced by the Senate and Congress, as we've recently seen. He has to fight for his legislation. That is a problem there with that absolute separation of powers. In this country, it's much easier for a prime minister who has a majority, whether by coalition or not, to get his or her way, and it's easier to pass legislation where where the parties are not that evenly balanced. So the questions here that we set out in the paper, and needs a bit more work on this, is really a fundamental question of what kind of basics decision-making system do you want? Do you want, once again, a very strong president, or do you want a more collegiate system? That's the fundamental distinction here.